think that there are plenty of successful entrepreneurs who jump directly into what they're going to do. My experience was that having worked in a couple of different startup organizations and also worked as an investor looking at those startup organizations, when it finally came time for me to kind of take my turn, I had a broader toolkit and, with benefit of hindsight, maybe a slightly higher chances of success, right? There are so many things that can go wrong in building a company, and so many decisions you make early, to kind of stick around and continue to persist over the course of the organization that you build. And so, even if in a small way, getting a little bit of pattern recognition before you take the leap, that's something I encourage most people to do.
Absolutely. So if you don't mind sharing some of those insights, like just at least a few that kind of stick out to you, some of the things that we should avoid doing early, and then some things that just really stand out as things you should do or you shouldn't do.
For sure. I mean, so many lessons, right? And you can, when I think about building a company, there are obviously a couple of major elements you have to think about, right? There's the product strategy. What's the pain point you're solving? How are you going to solve that problem? What mix of kind of technology or service you can deliver? There obviously is a go-to-market plan. How do you go out and get to market? There's all the operational infrastructure underneath that. There's all the people and organizational stuff. And then, to the extent that it's a regulated business, and a lot of my experience has been in the regulated side, how do you make sure from a regulatory and compliance and operational risk perspective, everything holds together as well and you end up not blowing up? If I were to try to distill a couple major lessons, number one I'd say is, if anything, start with your go-to-market plan, which sounds kind of counterintuitive, right? Because I think a lot of people, when they think about kind of starting something, they start with a very product-led perspective. My experience has been that more often than not, what will prevent a company from becoming successful or ultimately cause its untimely demise is lack of insight in terms of how you actually are going to get to market. Is it going to be through partnerships? Is it going to be direct? If it's direct, how are you going to do demand generation, right? Is it going to be sales-led? Is it going to be more marketing-led? Are you going to have to support your customer through fulfillment? Is it an enterprise solution, mid-market, or SMB? Or is it a direct-to-consumer type approach? And across all of those, there are a lot of different, now well-honed techniques you can use to make the business effective. But I do think that having a really strong angle on why do you have an advantage with respect to what I think of as distribution, kind of your go-to-market, I think you can get really crisp on that. That increases your chance of success pretty importantly. The other big lesson that I would distill is take your hiring decisions very seriously, right? Bad hires end up costing you in ways that are almost impossible to imagine at the outset. And the amount of churn and emotional distress, not to mention real business problems that come from making bad hires, can be pretty harmful, particularly when a company is very small.
Right, and especially in the beginning, yeah.
Right, once you're larger, you can afford to make more mistakes. But I do think that having it's not just a high bar thing, right? I think a lot of people are like, have a high bar for hiring. Like, what does that mean? Right. When I think about it, it's people who are very values aligned with what you're trying to do and have the right skills for the roles you're putting in. There are lots of great people out there, lots of people with tremendous skills. If you take an awesome person and put them into a role where they don't have the skills to be successful, that's shame on you. It's not shame on them.
Right.
And so trying to be really thoughtful about that early on, really, really key. And by the way, my experience has been if you can get it right 70 or 80% of the time, you're doing great. You're never going to get it 100% of the way there.
Right. So who was your first either like co-founder or someone who you started this with, or were you by yourself?
So the entity that it eventually became Funding Circle USA, I had a co-founder with. He was a business school classmate and still a good friend, and it was an idea that we had jointly developed. He brought a lot of insight on small business ownership. He'd built out a gym business that I was an investor in and kind of helped see through. And ultimately, the insight that I brought to bear was from my experience at Second Market, which is you can use a marketplace-driven model to facilitate capital formation and get basically investors to put investments or put money to work in investments that are more non-traditional. And so the ultimate kind of thesis was, hey, what if we create this marketplace thing that connects small business borrowers on the one hand with alternative sources of capital on the other? And that conversation was for us, summer 2011, and here we are, 7+ years later.
Great. And so when you just had this idea, it sounds great on paper, and there's lots of great ideas. What's your strategy to actually validate whether, of course, like there's one or two people who it sounds really great, but then what do you actually do to make sure that this is a really solid idea that you should pursue and invest a lot of money and time into?
It's a great question. What I would say is it's not an all or nothing decision. The reality is most businesses evolve quite a bit between initial conception and when you actually are successful and have scaled up. What I think ultimately shouldn't change that much is kind of what I think of as being the purpose of the business, right? When you hear the word pivot, what I hear is the kind of concept of the business, like its purpose for existing didn't really pan out, right? But there are lots of things that change around how do you go to market? Exactly what should the product be versus not be? What people do you need on the team to be successful? How should your branding look and feel, right? Those are things that ultimately are pretty mutable. But I think whether you're successful or not, it's kind of a question of does the purpose of the business really, does it make sense? And so distinguishing as an entrepreneur between like, why do I exist? Why am I working on the problem? Is it a real problem that needs to be solved? Versus some of the more market strategy and tactical things, which are ultimately ones that you need to iterate through to figure out what's going to work. That's a distinction that's really important to make. And I certainly have seen entrepreneurs who get those things confused, right? They think that they have product market fit, but they realize that their go-to-market plan doesn't make any sense. Or they think they have a product that will be relevant in a huge market, but they are too narrow in terms of thinking about what that product ought to include in order to allow them to scale. Those are real mistakes, but ultimately they're ones that if you take kind of a test and learn mindset to, and if you're very disciplined, I think you can power through.
Got it. All right, that's very interesting. Yeah, I have a lot of friends who are starting something, and it sounds really great on paper, and even they have validated that by generating demand, even in the beginning, seems like it's really a valid idea, and then they start pursuing it, and then a year or two into it, maybe they even get funding, but then it just doesn't work out for some reason. And it might be that what they thought or what initially generated the demand was not actually what people expected, or a variety of reasons.
And markets change, right?
Right.
The data that I've seen would suggest that for companies who receive, late seed or Series A funding, the failure rate, meaning they don't ultimately return investment capital, is still 70% plus. Meaning more than 2/3 of businesses who get to that phase ultimately don't return the capital invested in them. And so I don't think about it as, why do companies fail? Rather, I think about what makes companies who succeed succeed. And the unfortunate reality, but it's just one of those you got to pick yourself up and keep moving, is most don't work out for whatever reason. And so I do think the burden of proof on, is it a big enough idea in a big enough market with a good enough team, a good enough go-to-market, and the right approach to product, and the access to capital and other resources you need. I mean, you have to get a lot of things right. And it's not to say you have to get everything right. We certainly, in building up ELN and then Funding Circle, got a lot of things wrong, right? We made a lot of mistakes. Fortunately, none of them, at least as of yet, have been mortal mistakes, right? We've been able to fix things as we've gone along. But yeah.